I thought we could start with a comparison between Marr's levels, which a lot of neuroscientists are familiar with, and what Grossberg talks about right at the end, which is his modeling philosophy. It's similar in many ways, but there's a couple of differences. But I think in practice, he's more like Marr than he would ever admit. So the Marr's levels there are 3 levels. There's a computation or function, algorithm, which is sort of some kind of step-by-step breaking up of a problem. More a metaphor when computer scientists think of things, but for our purposes, setting up differential equations that describe what the problem is might as well be the algorithm. And implementation is, well, which cells, which network, what level of abstraction are we interested in? And in this paper, they kind of go starting from computation, work your way down, and then work your way up to kind of confirm that your implementation works. And so, yeah, this is my gloss on these things. It's a goal, a function, a method, and a structure, neural structure. But what Steve does is it looks a little bit more complicated, but in a sense, the Marr levels are sitting in this circuit. Steve typically starts with behavioral data. And early on, it was a lot of old school psych data stuff that's been kicking around since the time of behaviorists and some of the classic psychological studies. And from there, he will move towards design principles. These are sort of like normative criteria, but they're not exactly cost functions or fitness or things like that. He will tend to think in terms of trade-offs, and we'll get to that in a moment. So they're definitely thinking in a top-down way about how an animal ought to solve something given the constraints that it has. And from there, he typically goes to a level of abstraction that most people are not used to, because he's describing differential equations that kind of describe mesoscale entities. They're not exactly neurons. They could be groups of neurons, but they're also sort of abstract, unconscious entities, time-varying entities. And from there, there's a kind of loop going to neural data to further constrain it. So you kind of loop among all these different types of data and types of constraints. So everything is mutually constraining. And then there's a little bit of sort of feeding that into technological applications. There was more of it, I think, in the 80s and 90s. But I think at least some of us who've talked about it, many people here who were in the CNS department are now doing machine learning. And maybe we'll come to that at some point. But there is a possibility that if someone could make computationally efficient versions of some of these ideas, they might actually be useful in certain domains, particularly where you don't have millions of images to train on. That's just an intuition at the moment, because no one's really tried on very large data sets of the sort that have become current since 2012 or so.
There have been a lot of similar ideas from these sort of like models at the Steve level that have made their way into the deep learning world, though. So like all of the layer norm, batch norm, all that normalization stuff, that while it may not directly have been motivated by Steve's work per se, the same principles that motivated Steve to develop it as a sort of intrinsic part of the modeling, that the same ideas basically led people to do the same things on the deep learning side in maybe more ad hoc and manual fashion.
That's a good point, actually. So Steve normally has multiple motivations for some idea that he's put into a model. There may be an element of, oh, this was a hack initially, but there's also some neurobiological justification and some design principle, which is motivated by a mesoscale abstraction of what organisms need to accomplish. And like sort of said, normalization is seemingly trivial, but like something that people hadn't really talked about in a principled way. And we'll get to that soon, because I'm going to get into the math, actually. Right. So yeah, he definitely doesn't see himself as a machine learning researcher, but he thinks that as a sort of bonus, anything that is solid should be useful there, and has been used actually in the past. So what does he mean by design principles? In this chapter, there are a couple of interesting design principles. The first one is the principle of minimal anatomies. And he doesn't actually mean neuroanatomy, really. He means the simplest combination of differential equations that capture the behavioral data. When you actually work with these kinds of systems, you're kind of playing whack-a-mole. If you have more than one task or constraint that you're working with, you set something up and you kind of get 3 or 4 different things to work. But the idea, ideally, is that if you pull any one element out of your model, it should, almost kind of break down, or a good chunk of the data that you were able to explain is no longer explained. Yeah, so remove anything in the section, and sections of the data are no longer to be explained, no longer explained. And the next thing is this embedding principle, which I knew that he used the term embedding fields, but I never understood why he chose that term. So it was useful to see him explain that here. Oh yeah, so he talks about burning the candle from both ends. This was an interesting idea, that you can go both top down from the behavioral data and bottom up from brain data to clarify what the model can and cannot explain at its current state of derivation. So that's both similar and different from the Marr level, depending on how seriously you take the idea that the Marr levels go in one way and then the other. But you're kind of triangulating, you're kind of using 2 types of reasoning, 2 types of data to work towards a model in the middle. No model can explain everything, and at each stage of development, the model can cope with certain environmental challenges, but not others. So here he's outlining a kind of progressive elaboration of a model. And I like this next point a lot that I highlighted, which is that an important part is to characterize the boundary between the known and the unknown. You'd think that should be easy, but a model can actually highlight what you do know and what you don't know. I may have mentioned this in the past, that Dan Bullock, one of the CNS faculty and my former advisor, used to think of a computational model, as a mnemonic to remember the data. And it can often just serve as that, and that's quite a lot actually, because the exercise of trying to integrate disparate pieces of data, even if your model isn't the model or the correct model even, is a very good exercise. And it tells you, and you typically, if you actually put your model through its paces, you typically know what the limitations are on your model, what it can't do. You can ask any of us who've made models and we'll tell you immediately, this it cannot do. Okay, so I had this image in my head of what Steve meant by progressive sophistication. So you have to evolve the model in a self-consistent way. I don't really know exactly what he means by self-consistent, but I think it means the new bits and pieces or principles that you add can't break anything that's already there really, or at the very least have to use versions of the same principles without undermining the previous mechanisms. And then you get a progressively more realistic model. And so the method of minimal anatomies may hereby be viewed as a way to functionally understand how increasingly demanding combinations of environmental pressures were incorporated into brains during the evolutionary process. Here's an image that has been kicking around in my mind for a while, just as a way to remember this, which is that whatever you start with, you're going to have some entities that are abstractions, like an entire brain region if you're doing very coarse-grained modeling, or some kind of map that's a fuzzy version of some data. And then in your next iteration, if you happen to make one that's trying to get closer to the neural data, you kind of replace something that's just a simple node with something a little bit more complicated, but it will be using similar principles, and that's what I'm trying to show over there. And we had Paul Česek over a couple of months ago, and so this idea in the space of models is a lot like what Paul Česek is talking about, using the evolutionary tree to progressively understand how behaviors become more complicated. So, and it's not a coincidence that Paul thought about this, because he was also a Steve student. His advisors were Steve Grossberg and Dan Bullock. But I think that Paul's research program is really exciting, and because it takes the evolutionary tree and puts a behavioral framework on top of it. So I think there's a lot there for people to use. So So Steve talks about lumping and unlumping. What does he mean? So the embedding principle is the idea that you can sort of double click on some part of your network, and then that kind of takes you to some other network which uses similar ideas. So it's not some ad hoc kind of new piece that you've added when you zoom in closer. So if such an embedding principle cannot be carried out, that is, if the model cannot be unlumped or refined, then the previous model was simply put wrong. So it's like if as soon as I try to make something a spiking model after making a rate-based model, if everything breaks down, then you kind of have to go back to the drawing board. And Jesse was one of the people who kind of Jesse Palmer put a lot of effort into the spiking version, and he had transmitters changing modes. So that was a solid sanity check. But things have been building in that direction for a while with Steve's work. Evolutionary dead end. Anyway, so yeah, this is the reason why he called these things embedding fields, because he saw early on that you could take this basic idea, the recurrent competitive field that we've been talking about, and just sort of use them, like stack them on top of each other, basically, or inside each other. So the word embedding summarized the unlumped constraint. Unlumping constraint. The word fields was a shorthand for the fact that interactions within a neural network generate the emergent properties that map onto behavior. Slightly vague statement, but you can, but I kind of get it.
So, so Steve actually goes one step further with the embedding constraint. It's not just for going from mesoscale to a lower scale. So you take the you'll go through the RCF or whatever now, right? Like in that case, typically you have like the terms A, B, C, or whatever you want to call them. The terms for the decay, the hyperpolarization, and the polarization are all kind of fixed for the entire network. So that itself is kind of a lumped network for Steve, in the sense that all the neurons are having the same values. So he also has versions where those can also be unlumped, in the sense that any neuron can have any decay rate, any upper and lower values or whatever its constraints are, and still the math would be valid. So you would see that in that part too, it's a very valid system. So you go from something homogeneous and you make it more heterogeneous, it's still a valid argument or design principle.
Yeah, that's a good point. So just to reiterate, if you have a system that's symmetrical, highly symmetrical, where all the neurons look exactly the same, and if there's some functionality, you wouldn't want that to completely break down if you introduce variability. At best, I mean, ideally, you'd like even more functionality to emerge from that variability rather than less.
Is this similar to the notion of like lifting from a base or something like that?
That is an bookmark that for later, but yes, I think maybe. Yeah, that will explaining what you just said would take a while, but yeah, I think that's yes, I think that's a good idea. So here's how it might look, or it has looked. So on the left is a diagram depicting adaptive resonance theory. Then you have laminart, which is a laminar version of this principle, and then multiple kind of iterations of art lurking in this relationship between LGN, V1, V2. And then Jesse's paper, where you have similar principles, but now implemented with Hodgkin-Huxley spiking. And also he showed how acetylcholine can cause interesting mode shifts. And so you kind of place the adaptive resonance theory framework in a way that's accessible for someone who would really like to model things using spikes. And those additional degrees of freedom, such as neural modulators and things like that, can potentially lead to new functionality, I think, would be one thing that, Jesse, if you have any other comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe because I brought it up a couple of times, you keep bringing up my stuff. I mean, it's kind of a small piece, but yeah, certainly to show that the spiking stuff is important. Obviously, like the laminar stuff is much more sophisticated in terms of connectivity, which is pretty important, even though it's not spiking.
I'm biased towards
I certainly wanted
diagrams.
Yeah. I certainly wanted to, and I did in my postdoc, do something that was kind of both, that had some connectivity that was trying to do something art-like and have spiking, but it, you know, it could learn and do some things that were art-like, but, you know, certainly wasn't. I didn't do it with Steve, so certainly wasn't as close to all of his principles as something like Laminar. And it didn't, you know, wasn't never finished. But yeah.
Work in progress.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of versions of all these things that kind of fit together to create a picture of the, you know, what his vision is. But a lot of his stuff, I think, still has space to be explored too, in terms of combining different things together.
Like in the little hippocampus model that I'm developing right now, there are things that, even with me not like explicitly trying to say I want to make an art model, I'm like, oh well, that works a lot like art. Just so happened that it was like that. So these are principles that, when you're looking at the world in a certain way, some of these ideas crop up. So there's this kind of progressive unlumping and embedding that goes on. So you might start with what I drew last time, which is fairly simple, I think, intuitive to understand. And then you get like really fairly, you know, intensely elaborated models. I was thinking that, you know, speaking of progressive, you can go from something simple, minimal, to something fairly proggy. And that's one issue with some of these models, is that you know, 21st century schizoid man is scary, even if you like it. So kind of related to the design idea is a set of dilemmas that Nico pointed out last time. He couldn't attend today. I'm just using his summary, because this will come up, and I thought it would be good to kind of have all of them laid out, instead of whenever it is that Steve feels like talking to us about them. So there's a hierarchy or set of dilemmas that Grossberg is very good at highlighting. The noise saturation dilemma, which is
before you go into dilemma, for people in machine learning, this is what is in vulgar terms called as a trade-off. So Steve,
yes.
The equivalent is whatever people in machine learning use as a trade-off, but Steve sees it as actually a very important natural constraint of physical or biological systems. It's not just a trade-off thing. It does reveal something very deep about the structure or the biological system that's acting on. So
yeah. So the noise saturation dilemma is, we need to be able to find features, say edges over many orders of magnitude of input. It could be any sort of feature, but like light is a good example, or even sound, like volume and can vary over very large orders of magnitude, but we still need to extract useful information from these things, or illumination or can vary by quite a bit. So how is it that we don't get kind of, if we're able to sense very sensitive, subtle things, say in a quiet room, how do we not go deaf in very loud situations? Well, we can. But the other dilemma that he talks a lot about is the stability plasticity dilemma. We have to learn quickly, and we want that learning to be stable. So that's the trade-off. We have to be plastic enough to learn, but not so plastic that we lose what we've acquired. There's an asymmetry there. And this I think is pretty well known, the exploration dilemma. We need to know when we're making enough progress on satiating our current drive to stay put, or whether we need to either explore physically to help satiate the drive, or whether we can make progress related to another drive. So there's a lot of research on this. I think everyone in the machine learning world, definitely in RL and stuff, is aware of this reinforcement learning. But I don't think there are any kind of formal solutions to this type of thing. They're all rules of thumb and pragmatic kind of things to do with, there's a topic called information foraging, where a lot of this gets talked about. But our focus today will be on the noise saturation dilemma, because it involves some idiosyncratic ways of talking from Steve. So, you know, what is noise? Does anyone have like there's different ways of defining it?
I like to think of noise as like a weed. It's something that you aren't interested in or don't want right now, but might be perfectly functional in another context or framework.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this whole signal versus noise story is what people kind of understand, and there's an observer dependence in that. One person's noise is another person's signal. It's not exactly what Steve is talking about here initially, but that part of it eventually. So there's highly variable and useless components of the signal, which uselessness is subjective, and then there's an issue of scale or size, which is also subjective, but in a slightly different way. Like, what does small actually mean relative to what? But there's also this thing which Steve is very good at highlighting, which engineers are well aware of in signal processing, but which is not often thought about. If you have unchanging aspects of a signal or a pattern, they do not convey any difference that makes a difference. So you can get rid of it in many situations. And that's a big part of what he explains in this chapter. And how taking that idea in its simplest form and then slightly kind of iterating it or mutating it gives you some very interesting tools for doing processing in vision, for instance. Oops, I wanted to, this is too big. Okay, you can see it, right? Yeah, so there's an interesting almost metaphysical way of getting at this topic, and I think maybe Fechner also kind of approached it from this perspective. Like, what does it mean to be an organism? What does it mean to be restricted in space and time? There's some sort of limitation, right? So the way that Steve approaches this is to say that a cell only has a finitely many excitable sites that can be turned on or off by external or internal inputs. That may seem like he's talking about discretization, but that's not exactly what he means. So the way I like to think about it is that we're talking about the fact that any limited entity, by virtue of its physical is the literal boundedness, must have a limited view of infinity. And by infinity, I just mean like, anything that can vary in an unbounded way, like a real line or something. So this is a sort of mnemonic that, and partly inspired by the same kinds of things that I was very interested in the Weber-Fechner law. And Steve also in this chapter, as you'll see, was talking a lot about that. I didn't want to get into that because I think it's better to work out that stuff on your own, in my opinion, the Fechner stuff. But if you want, I can do that later. Or meaning not this week, but so imagine that we're talking about like a single cell or like an abstracted cell that is this green thing down here. And imagine that it has representation space. It has some real estate in its structure that it can devote to something that varies. This reality could be a feature space like sound levels that can go from 0 to infinity. It could be locations to the left and right of you which don't have any natural bounds. There's many kinds of quantities or positions that can vary quite a bit. But by virtue of being limited, here's like the most sort of trivially simple way of starting to do something like this, is that you kind of take the approach of the Riemann sphere, if any of you have ever seen this, which is like you start at the North Pole and like draw a straight line to this thing that you're representing. So that means that every point on your surface, whatever that happens to be, corresponds to something in reality. There's just a one-to-one kind of thing. And what you'll notice is that depending on the convention of this spherical cow, some parts of the system will occupy quite a bit of real estate. And as you get higher and higher, smaller and smaller regions of that circle get allocated space. And that's a way to start thinking about saturation. which is that when you have very high inputs, you're maxing out, you're reaching the limits of your representation space. So this is a severe constraint on anything that's limited in this way. So it's worth thinking about, even in this very abstract sense, what it means to be limited and what that requires in terms of behavior. So how best do we use the limited neural real estate that we have? In the context of neurons, that means, or even these abstracted neurons, rate models, there's some lower level and some max firing rate. So the activities are bounded. So if you imagine a hypothetical neuron that is sensitive to very, very tiny little sounds, and all other things being equal, how can it not completely get maxed out by slightly louder sounds? In other words, how does it do dynamic gain control, automatic gain control? So Steve makes a good point here that the functional unit is not the individual cell. And I was exposed to this idea early enough that I didn't realize it needed to be made even, but there's a paper on neural coding, the metaphor of neural coding by Romain Brett, who's a computational neuroscientist. And it's a reasonably good paper, but there was an interesting critique he made of coding, which he would not have made if he was using this type of framework. He was like, well, if I have like rods and cone, like 3 color sensitive cells, and I have a R, G, and a B, I cannot distinguish between a green, a very, very active green cone and like a slightly active adjacent one, or the other way around. I mixed it up. But the idea being that if you have like some sort of Q factor, like a bump in some space, then taking that whole thing and pushing it up could make it look indistinguishable from high activity that peaks somewhere else. So he calls that the paradox or the fallacy of the Overwise neuron. Now, it's a reasonably good point if you think that the brain is making use of disconnected atoms of experience, of representation, whatever you want to call it. But Steve, right at the get-go, says, well, that's not the unit. Like the individual neuron is not conveying anything. It's groups, ensembles, vectors of activity that are the unit for information. And that ties in a way to this noise saturation dilemma in a very interesting way. Why did this happen? Yes, okay. Duplicated some of my diagrams. Okay, so, oops. So just to elaborate and give a kind of physical intuition for what saturation means, I've always liked...
You're not sharing.
Oh, stop sharing, okay. Share. Working now?
Yeah, good.
Hopefully this doesn't keep happening. Sorry about that. So what we need some intuition about what saturation is. Like you can think about it in these information processing terms, but I like to have solid physics-based analogies, physical analogies. So imagine that your neuron is like a balloon, a water balloon, and that its firing rate is like the size or the volume of it, so that as it fills up, the reason I picked a water balloon instead of a bucket was this sort of non-linear kind of thing, which is that eventually the more you can't really fill it anymore without it bursting. And you can actually hear neurons burst when they're overexcited in some cases. But obviously that's not the only way that a neuron could in principle respond. You could have a very linear firing rate and then some kind of cap. You do see I mean, it's very rare for people to explore many orders of magnitude, but when people do explore the FI curve, the input current and the firing rate, they'll see linearity for a little region and then not typically something sigmoidal. But then for very, very high inputs, When we talked about the Hodgkin-Huxley model, we looked at that. There's this, the spikes start to get really smaller, and eventually they attenuate. But in any case, that attenuation marks the upper limit from the perspective of any kind of rate code. You can't increase the input indefinitely and get responses from the neuron. So as I just said, the signal is at the level of the pattern, not the neuron. And he points this out, that it's a vector. And the thing he wants to say is that the key pattern is the input compared to the total input. So it's the ratio, the ratio of the inputs coming in. So this intrinsically, this term, the normalization term, intrinsically means that the meaning of a particular input depends on everything else in its club, its ensemble. And if you want to kind of make that more inactive, for lack of a better term, but locally in the brain, what that means is that downstream, the cells that are receiving activity from some network are not receiving isolated neurons. They're receiving groups of neurons and comparing them using the same kinds of competitive dynamics sometimes. So this kind of ratio processing is the key idea, which for us, people who joined grad school in CNS, we kind of took that for granted, but it's not always the case that people think that it's only the ratio among neurons that matters. And there's reasons to think that the overall rate does matter in some situations. So it's not the case that this is always true. It's just Steve's first pass at this, and it's very useful in certain domains. So, you know, I wouldn't say that all information signaling in the brain takes this form, but it's a good first pass for thinking about ensembles as the key. So, but that top-down kind of attitude about ratios, so ratios will be good for factoring out multiplication. So if I multiply everything, all the i's by some factor, that factor is ignored, basically. The nice thing that ratios do. So, you know, and people have loved this since the time of the Pythagoreans, right? Like, what is it that's similar, you know, with octave similarity and things like that, the ratios. But there's a lot of interesting psychological evidence that something like ratio processing is happening. And this has been known for a long time, since the 19th century, if not, yeah, 19th century. Have all of you heard of the Gelb effect? The Gelb effect it's really cool in person. I don't know whether I've experienced it, maybe once. You hold up a piece of paper in a dark room where there's no background. So it's like, you imagine a deep cavern-like thing. And the only thing you can see is a piece of paper, and you illuminate it with a beam of light that only lights that piece of paper. Both a black piece of paper and a white paper, if there's no contrast on the piece of paper, will look the same. And that's getting at the idea that what we see is not light per se, but contrast between different regions of illumination. So it's well known. Steve has kind of taken that as his basis for how all processing happens. Yes, Caleb?
The reverse is true for an ordinary projector screen at a movie theater. The screen is white, and when the projector shines on it, it appears black. The parts that are still white, they haven't changed color. They're still white, but we see them as black pure because of the contrast with the rest of the screen. So exactly. The reverse is true.
Yeah, yeah.
And we've all experienced that.
In fact, a version of that is coming up. And I'm guessing most of you have seen this figure on the right. It's from Adelson's work, although that figure is not in that paper. I was trying to find the exact citation, Karthik probably knows. But anyway, he's done a bunch of these kinds of figures. And to this day, I have to use my hand and stick it in between the diagram to convince myself that A and B are not different. So I block it with my thumb because it's just so astounding. But and there, local contrast matters, and we'll get to that in a moment. The local contrast as opposed to global contrast. Oops. Then I did a hand-drawn thing and got pasted twice. It's still sharing, right? So now we can look at this little trick that off-surround inhibition can do in the very, very simple network. So this is not the current competitive field. There's no feedback. So if X is the activity of this neuron or abstract neuron or group of neurons, we have a decay term, a passive decay term, which makes it like an LC circuit. It just decays if there's nothing else happening. B is the max term, so it can't go beyond that. I is the input, and here's the off surround. And this J not equal to I quite literally gives you the off part of the off surround. So every other input to the other cells is inhibiting this cell. So you can think of it like, well, basically like, it's not that the cells are inhibiting each other, it's that their inputs are inhibiting in an off surround way. So it's purely feed forward input. And if you're working with relatively static inputs, you can ask, well, what's the steady state? It works actually for time varying inputs, and you'll end up with some integrals in there and you'll get averages. So it worked quite beautifully. But just do the standard thing. We want to know what the steady state is. So we set the derivative to 0, and then we do a little bit of algebra. And here's this sneaky little trick. The fact that X is only excited by its corresponding input, I should have had subscript I there, means that when you regroup, you have sub I and so the total input all gets summed up together to give you this I term. And then you can, just do the rearranging, and you get that the asymptotic value of X is this theta I, the pattern, the ratio version of the pattern, and this scaling factor, which interestingly, if you write it this way, you can tell that as the intensity of the overall input, the total input coming into that field increases, this gets closer and closer to 1. So paradoxically, perhaps, the higher the input overall, the more accurately you're able to represent a pure ratio. So I've always gotten a great kick out of this little algebra trick. But I think there's a problem with it. It took me a while to kind of recognize it. So I think there's an issue. So I found some slides from Ennio Mingola covering similar territory. He was also a faculty member there. And so this is kind of saying the same thing as what I just showed. Theta is the pattern, that it's the ratio version of the input to the entire field. And you have this scaling factor, which is the kind of energy term, which will affect the system when I is of the same order as the decay term. As I goes to infinity, X approaches theta. All of this, so this is what you've already seen. But one thing to point out is that when we use inhibition in this way, there's an implicit interneuron that's doing a sign flip, right? Because excitatory neurons cannot on their own inhibit anything. They have to go via interneurons. So if we replace that implicit inhibition with explicit interneurons, then you don't get perfect tracking. So basically, the things that are providing the inhibition cannot increase in an unbounded way. So even though this is a useful principle, the fact that the inhibitory neurons can't follow their inputs forever means that there will be a constraint on this. If I'm missing anything, any people just jump in.
I mean, that's true. So that's why if you look at, so that's part of his unlumping process, basically. So you can think of this as the lumped system. So that's another level of unlumping that he does. So there is the fast excitation followed by the slow inhibition. So instead of introducing it as minus xi times sum over ij that you had in the previous slide, he would actually introduce the inhibitory neuron y. There are other ways in which you can actually change that so it becomes an unlumped system. But while you won't get this perfect pattern energy factorization out fully, it does still follow this principle up to a certain bound. So that is still maintained.
Yeah, so you have this kind of platonic ideal of gain control, like an unflappable system, right? That if anything gets more accurate, the more stress you put on it, which is not the case, obviously, right? Where we know that neurons can die from overactivity. We know epilepsy exists. So we can think of this as like the spherical cow that gets corrected.
Yeah, sorry to always kind of jump in with my stuff,
please do. That's the whole
but
point.
yeah, so I did 4 different versions of the architecture, one being this rate-based version, essentially. The other one of them is actually with interneurons, and one's with distance dependence. I didn't do distance dependence and interneurons together, but I did do an interneuron-based thing where it's a separate cell that does the inhibition. And what you get is, not surprisingly, oscillations, so you're going to get a reverberation. Oh, yeah. You're going to get a reverberation, right?
Because goes with the territory. Yeah. As soon as you have a little delay in the inhibitory neurons coming up, you have like oscillations are on the cards.
Yeah, and it's going to depend upon the input strengths and how strong that oscillation is, and all that stuff, and what your delay times are. Obviously.
I've definitely gotten that quite often. I just like to bookmark anything that's like keep in mind, watch out. Okay, so here's another math trick which I highly recommend you just do on your own. So here in the previous network, the system had only multiplicative inhibition. But here we're adding another term with C, which is the hyperpolarization term, and this means that the cell can be actually inhibited below 0. When you do some juggling and you get this term, which is why he calls it Weber law, etc. I haven't fully I have some complaints about the way Steve talks about the Weber law. So, but you see the pattern here, and you see this kind of, it's almost like an effective threshold. So it has to beat this in order to be positive. So what does that have to do with zero spatial frequency noise? His idea, which we talked about, is that if there's this common mode, there's something that's just there, boringly constant, you'd like it to be exactly 0. So just plop this in there. I did that. This is there in the collab simulation. I said this is what I set it to. Pick a value of b, n-1 times c, where n is the number of neurons. And then for free, you get this exact common mode eliminator. It's quite cool. And again, just simple high school math. And I simulated it just to show it to people, because sometimes Steve doesn't show the time varying aspect of these sort of trivial networks, but it's nice to make sure that you understand this really simple stuff. So what I did was I had a network like the one from the previous slide, and here's the capital I, the sum of all the inputs. And what I did was at a quarter of the way into the trial, I doubled every input, but they are still all equal. You can see that the total input increases. The system is none the wiser. And then at the halfway point, I increase one of the inputs by 0.1. Everything was 2, and then one of them goes to 2.1. And then you see this doesn't have any positive feedback, so it's not going to self-amplify, but you see suddenly one thing pops out and has non-zero activity. So this, again, the perfect version of common mode cancellation. So, and this is an example, a very simple example of symmetry breaking. That when the symmetry of all the inputs is broken, you have non-trivial information coming out of this ensemble. So the kind of take-home message there is that perception requires contrast. And one of my favorite ways to think about this is the fact that if you present an image to the eyes using this, I forget the device that does it, you can stabilize images with respect to microseconds, with respect to movement. And typically what happens is the image fades. And a couple of former CNS people, actually, Martina Poletti and Michele Rucci, have this review about this. They did this actually it's an experiment, but they cover some of this, that images fade and may eventually disappear when physiological motion of the retinal stimulus is reduced or eliminated. What I find fascinating about this is that not all animals have microseconds. I think everybody has heard of those experiments where they place dead flies near a frog, and because the frog basically can't see the flies because they're not moving, and the frog starves surrounded by food. So at some point in evolution, the animals decided, if there's nothing changing in the world, I shall provide some change by moving slightly. So when deprived of contrast, we supply some of our own. The Ganzfeld experiments are when you present a constant illumination to both eyes. Here, you don't actually see nothing. What happens is way weirder. You hallucinate. So when you present a featureless field, all kinds of weird things start to happen. So the way I like to think about this is that stabilizing at one level destabilizes at some other level. This has been known for a while. What I did not know until today was that it was known as the prisoner's cinema. So the principle that we can collect is that there's a couple of different kinds of Grossbergian denoising. The recurrent competitive field, which uses nonlinearity, can squash small signals and amplify strong ones. But that is scale dependent. So maybe through learning or through other principles, you need to decide or figure out where to place the knee point in your sinusoid, or what counts as below 1 versus above 1 for faster than linear. And that will, so that's a little bit more fiddly, getting those to work. So in a sense, learning what small is and what big is does actually involve some awareness of the actual environment. And once you do have that through learning or something, you can do squashing of small inputs. And you use hyperpolarization to perform common mode suppression. So out of curiosity, I wanted to look at what just stochastic noise input looks like and how that symmetry breaking works in a recurrent competitive field. So in the collab that I sent, this is the first simulation, which does have positive feedback and the nonlinear transfer functions. And here you have appreciable inputs, meaning they go from 0 to 1, but the mean is 0.5. They're drawn from a uniform distribution. And the only thing I've done is one of the inputs is at the halfway point constant. It becomes 1. So it isn't even like standing out particularly compared to all the other inputs. You wouldn't necessarily see it always, but this recurrent competitive field faster than linear picks out that. Everything else is sort of, it's not exactly 0. I didn't tweak everything perfectly. And the way I like to look at networks is this way. So now I'm looking at a heat map. So the color, lighter colors are higher activities. So you see that there's this random input, and this one cell gets stable input that's a little bit higher than the average, and that gets amplified. So here's another way to think about, or another way to see the kinds of noise cancellation that these networks are capable of. So we won't fully be able to kind of appreciate what he means yet, but I think this is an example of refinement where we've seen what uniformity can do. It makes the system silent. But what if we could construct a uniformity with the help of top-down and bottom-up agreement, or not lack of agreement? If there's a perfect mismatch, then you can get suppression if there's some kind of balance or out of phaseness, and in this case, in the spatial sense. Whereas if they're in phase, then you can get some amplification. So you can use this kind of zeroing out phenomenon to build something. And in this case, it's the resonance between bottom up and top down. And when we get to art, it'll take a while, but this will be one of the little ingredients that we will make use of. And there are ways of getting things very close to this to work with spiking. And even though I haven't implemented it yet, I'm pretty sure that some of the stuff that Mac likes to talk about with the layer 5 cell being a coincidence detector is just, it so beautifully fits with this idea of bottom up and top down. And also with our lab's work on feedback and feed forward connections, you can almost see it, that agreement between these two sets of inputs coming into two parts of the neuron, the apical dendrite and the cell body, can create a kind of resonance. And that particular resonance is not, you know, physics resonance. It's like you get a burst saying, yes, I've seen this before, or something of that sort. And there, I think you can get more rich dynamics because the tonic mode conveys something that zero firing does not convey. So there's a lot there.
Johan, part of that is kind of like not at the detail level that you and Mac have talked about. Part of that is already like what like Steve did with Max, if I remember.
Right. Yeah. It's in there.
Yeah. So in fact, when we talk about the spike, if we get to the spiking version of art, you'll actually see that. If I remember correctly, Steve does talk about layer 5 as the coincidence detector. It's pretty much the same language he uses. I might be wrong. I might be wrong on the details. Maybe Jesse can correct.
I believe it's layer 4 actually.
Layer 4, maybe. I don't know. I don't know exactly.
So, but layer 5 kind of plays in that picture. So it's just more like layer 4.
But if he knew about Matthew Larkham's data, he might, you know, quickly change his mind, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Max's model is kind of a mess. I think it has some relevant ideas, but you know.
Yeah. The point being that when you have adaptive resonance theory or even mini versions of that in your mind, you can interpret the data, and even if you're coming up with, like from Steve's perspective, slightly toy things that don't do a whole lot, you're still kind of making some hypotheses that can be tested, and you can interpret what layer 5 is doing using a quasi-functional kind, like very low level but still functional.
For sure.
So yeah.
Another way to just a quick point to sort of make is that maybe a different way to think about it is that every cell in the body, and neurons in particular, has got the ability to kind of deal with what its context is and what it wants to do about it. And neurons have this specialized ability, and in some cases, remarkable ability to separate out the context from their action. And so the layer 5 pyramidal neurons are just this sort of freak, weirdo, giraffe-looking cell that has spread its head away from its body in this really, really weird way, in such that it can take advantage of this coincidence detection, but make it really powerful in a way that other cells don't seem to have committed to. But every cell can kind of do something like this. It's not something that would only be somewhere, right? It's sort of like a pervasive feature, I think, of neurons in particular. And the layer 5s are just a really abnormal kind of expanded version.
Yeah. One of our colleagues, Stefan Berto, who worked with Dan Bullock also, he has a really nice model of coincidence detection, biophysical model using M currents and stuff like that for CA1, and he's has a version for Cortex also, and that also has this nice kind of where balance does one thing and mismatch does something else. So you can definitely come up with more biophysically detailed ways of constructing some of these Lego blocks. So yeah, this also actually reminded me of this refinement idea, which is that the basic idea of common mode suppression, you can actually then sort of make use of it if you construct things that cause common mode suppression. So it's like taking something that initially is just noise cancellation and then turning it into something more. An interesting way to think about refinement. And Steve uses this a lot in vision, and this I think we should like go very slowly, baby steps towards all this. But the basic idea is that instead of taking the entire network and computing the total input and then subtracting, you do this in local patches. And it may be that you need to do this in a multi-scale kind of way, so that, and the typical idea is that V1 has a fairly narrow kind of perspective, and then it's bigger and bigger and bigger. So you could think of the visual system as doing this at various spatial scales, and ultimately you get to where there's no longer a spatial scale, and you have objects detection that can happen in anywhere in the visual field. But what this effectively does, which we will try and show in more detail, is it picks out edges. Because if you're doing this computation locally, you can imagine it like you're sliding along and saying, is there anything changing? And so in local regions where nothing is changing, it's all a bit meh. So it's where things do change that you're like, that's something interesting. And then you get high activity there. So the SOGs and dogs, the sum of Gaussians and difference of Gaussians becomes like the next iteration of the algebra trick that we showed. Here you'll have to again do more tweaking because there's many more degrees of freedom now, because you have the height of each Gaussian, the width of each Gaussian. There's a reasonable amount of evidence that stuff like this is working at the mesoscale. And the Heger has got his name attached to normalization now because of the fact that there's plenty of data, and this 92 paper covers a lot of it, reviews some of it. But yeah, we'll be encountering this many times, so we can revisit it. So this is all a preview, but you can kind of see what's happening. You have a stimulus, and this feature set is just, you know, the stimulus kind of copied in a sense, but potentially with that common mode suppression. And then you get edge detections of various sort, and you can do it in like steps, so that first you're looking for one sort of edge, and then you kind of sharpen that with contrast enhancement, or winner take all networks. So we'll see how this works soon, but I think just looking at it, you can get a sense of what the network is doing, and the equations that we just saw more or less are all you need to do this. And yeah, we'll get to why you need to do all this to the system. So, but basically, in the other set of metaphor, this is computation on the visual input. This is what it consists of. It's always, it has a more geometric kind of quality, because it's always about the juxtapositions of different activities. It's not just something computing some number. It's about the relationship among all of them in some field. And this is something that I was interested in, because my work was on timing, and I was interested in the temporal version of this. I'm sure Steve has done versions of this, but there's a nice link to be made with something that Jürgen Schmidhuber, the machine learning AI researcher, has said: interestingness is the first derivative of beauty. I've always liked that line. And Sorb actually worked with him. He did his postdoc with Jürgen. And I like to think of what he's talking about as the finding of temporal edges. So if you, this is just an implementation of the equations at the bottom. So instead of an off surround, so a question you could ask yourself is, for a one-dimensional temporal phenomenon, what might off surround be like? What's the analog of off surround? Does anyone, I mean, you could, some of you can just look at that equation and guess what I'm talking about, but if you don't know what that what y is, then you might like ask yourself what a temporal off surround might be. In this particular case, it's just a running average. That's all it is. So if something is happening and it's been constant for a while, the running average keeps track of what it has been. That's your temporal off surround, because I'm using that to inhibit. And what does this give you? If you pick the parameters right, etc., is that when something changes in time now instead of space, you can get a burst, which effectively is the difference between the change, the input coming in, and the average, which is the expectation, which is what you're averaging. So the discrepancy between your expectation and the actual change, the fact that you can't perfectly track it, gives you useful information, or like an appreciable signal that you can use to then orient yourself, change your behavior, various things. And this is actually not a bad way to model dopamine neurons when they're doing prediction errors and things like that. In fact, this is more or less how it's done. There's a bit more bells and whistles, because you need to factor in time delays and things like that. All of which is present in Grossbergian models.
So it's totally right, because it's just a negative and a negative, but the last term there, it's a little bit, for those
I forgot.
less familiar with.
Be a minus sign, sorry.
I mean, it's correct, because the minus sign carries through and the C goes first, and it's C minus X, minus C minus X. A minus, you can, the equation's correct. It's just easier to write it as if there's, it's easier to think of it as inhibition if there's a minus sign inside, as well as
No, there's a mistake. This should have been a minus. But
it is a mistake. It has to be a minus.
But yeah, so
okay, yeah,
this is really
yeah.
It's a nice principle because it makes surprise interpretable as an edge in the in time varying space. Says my internet connection is unstable, but yeah. So that is not a bad seg into the first part of the chapter, which I thought kind of launched into some more psychology data that maybe a lot of neuroscientists aren't that familiar with. So, but what he's doing is motivating in an interesting way the importance of differential equations, because that's the best way to model things that are sensitive to time and not just abstract order or things like that. So the way he starts it is this is how he seg into why we need differential equations. This effect is I've just done a scribbly schematic, but this stuff has been studied for quite a while, and you present items of various sorts. They could be words or visual things, and you're presenting them in order, where one thing at a time, and there's a time gap between the items, and there's also a time gap between the blocks. So small w is the time gap between items, and the big W is between the blocks, where you're repeating the same list. And you present it over and over again, and people will learn associations. And you can test it by showing one of the middle items and saying, what's next? And you see this very interesting effect called the Boeing effect, where the number of errors is maximal in the middle. Another way people talk about it is that there's a recency effect and a primacy effect. Stuff at the beginning of list learning is often learned pretty well. Stuff at the end is often learned pretty well. We're kind of used to it. It's sort of intuitive in a way, but why? Why does it happen? Collect your explanations now. Why do you think it's happening? And the point he's trying to make here is that those W's
we lost somewhere in the middle, so we should.
What?
If you collect it now, it'll be lost somewhere in the middle. Sorry.
Yeah. No, but it's good to think about these things, because you may just come up with the exact same solution that Steve came up with. It's not like super complicated, but it's it's fun to think about.
It is also interesting if you want to. I know this is something you're always interested in doing, Johan, but hammering a wedge into the notion that the brain is a computer, because a lot of the early psych explanations of working memory were based on this metaphor of a computer and having slots, memory slots that things get put into in working memory, and some probability of those things dropping out and so on, but none of them could effectively describe or predict any of the data about the full set of data about working memory. So Steve has one of his sort of really nice, simpler, very straightforward papers. I forget the name of it. It's something, somebody else can jump in if they remember fully, but it's something like serial and binary versus continuous and parallel. And so it really draws a contrast between the earlier computer metaphors for memory versus these sort of differential equation-based parallel processing versions.
Right. So in fact, that's kind of why I have that title up there, the time matters even for associating symbols. So it's very funny that Saurabh brought this up, because we've had this tussle back and forth about how useful calling the brain a computer is. But
I also saw that you have used codes for symbols.
Call them whatever you like. But anyway, I don't think anybody would disagree with the idea that words are pretty symbolic, and they have this discrete quality to them. But and there's no doubt that there are types of rule-based phenomenon that humans are capable of using, which are very loose with respect to time. So I could do the exact same procedure with a huge temporal gap between step 1 and step 2, and I suddenly do step 3. These things are possible. They might actually be difficult sometimes, but we can do them. So that's a way of saying that there are certain kinds of invariances in the way that we represent step-by-step behaviors that give you a lot of flexibility about when you do what. But this is not about motor control, so we're not get there yet. But even things like this, the symbols, which in the 50s and 60s people wanted to say, it's just like a computer. You have slots and registers and things like that. But when you go kind of whole hog into that symbol domain, you very quickly throw away real time because you use conventional indexes such as order and stuff like that. And that's what Saurabh was getting at, which is that only this type of model, which takes time as seriously as you can, which is with differential equations, can you explain some of these phenomena. And so this is just the other way to represent the same thing, where instead of errors, it's success. It's same data. It's called primacy and recency. And the thing that Steve wants to frame it as, which I think is mischievous but cool, is that it seems like there's a backward effect in time. That, like, because how can something that, like, how can the fact that of my memory of something in the middle be affected by what happens later? Like the fact that these times matter, capital W or small w, means that my ability to associate something now is influenced by what I see later. So because if I didn't see anything afterwards, if it was the last item in the list, my memory would be good. But if I'm in the middle, somehow it's not. So, you know, scare quotes for everything here. Somehow the future is affecting the past. And here's where, you know, collect your explanation, because it's not that complicated. It's just a nice, clean way of talking about it. And in the way that I've presented this chapter, we kind of already have the infrastructure to guess what Steve wants to say. And so I scribbled this, but the idea is that actual association, however it happens, you know, pairwise, Hebbian learning, whatever you want to do with it, is happening more or less simultaneously. So we're not making any claim about non-locality in time. But what we're saying is that the trace, the working memory trace, or however you want to call it, that is the consequence of having experienced something, lingers for a while. It has some temporal properties that you can model with a differential equation, and that those traces are, well, can anyone guess what those traces are doing to each other?
You just wrote it there.
I wrote it, yeah. Oh yeah, I wrote it there. Sorry. But yeah, so if they compete with each other, for reasons that I'm not clear on, I haven't looked at these kinds of models in a while, of the reasoning, but if these representations, perhaps because of some other constraint or design principle, if they're able to interfere with each other, and here interfere means precisely this kind of on-center off surround, then something that happens later is affecting not the past, but the lingering effect of the past in the present. So you can think of these traces, people call them eligibility traces sometimes, different terms for it. But all of the effects are happening in the present, but it's about what the sort of reverberations or echoes of what has already happened are the basis for associative learning in a particular moment. You can imagine the window as linking a bunch of things together, and the strength of that particular trace having an effect on how good the memory is.
How much are you planning on going into working memory?
What did you say?
How much are you planning on going into the working memory aspects of it?
Well, not now. This is all I had for today.
Okay.
So anytime soon, right?
But yeah, because we'll be revisiting all these ideas, and when we talk about your model, Saurabh, there'll be some things related to this. And but yeah,
I was going to say that, so there is a slight distinction to be made between like just pure associative learning and working memory. But in the working memory case, you have this Boeing phenomenon, and the easiest way to think of it is that early parts of the list, as they're being, you know, if you think of your neurons in your previous earlier models, graphs, you know, drawings, whatever, if those neurons basically have come to represent or have been learned as, let's say, alphabet letters or numbers or whatever, and we're presenting an arbitrary sequence of those letters, numbers, whatever, as you present a letter, it activates its representation, its node, right, neuron, whatever, and then the input goes away, and due to feedback, which we haven't seen yet in equations necessarily, but due to feedback, after that's gone, that neuron, that population of neurons that represent that letter, have the ability to sort of self-sustain. And when the next one comes in, essentially you have that competitive thing, the competitive interactions that will prevent the second item, the third item, and so on, from having or achieving the same level of activity as the early ones. And depending on parameters, you can actually get that Boeing phenomenon, because later occurring ones now have stronger bottom-up input relative to other cells' already existing activation levels. And so you get, once you get to a long enough list based on the parameter set, you actually see those newer arriving things having a stronger activation. All of it sort of beautifully falls.
Right. Yeah.
All of it beautifully falls right out of this idea of on center, off surround, right? And like in that same sort of way that you're talking about Chizek's like evolutionary programming to behavior, Steve always thought, like, what are the like sort of minimal conditions and architectures that we know exist, that are universal, that describe these wide sets of phenomena. And the same thing that you're using to describe the ability to process patterns and learn illuminance invariant sort of patterns that correspond to things in the world in vision. That same architecture gives you working memory, right? It explains working memory data in a way that no other model can. And so that's sort of this unifying thing that just keeps popping up, right? And it's just too cute almost how much stuff it explains. And then obviously it's like a theme in variations where you modify where needed to expand on certain types of data. Certain, like obviously sequential data is not the same as a vision where you have maybe an attempt to explain static inputs and so on. But again, you vary what needs to be varied.
So I got confused reading this section of the book.
Okay.
Because he's talking about stuff I know, but not the language isn't quite right.
This is a big problem with this.
It's a problem. So as a psychologist, I'm trying to figure this out, and it's just not quite making sense. So explain the relationship of what he's saying here to proactive and retroactive interference.
So it's more or less what Saurabh was saying, but so if you think about the traces of each of these items,
right?
The association can only form when they are above some threshold. Let's suppose that the threshold is just whether they're firing or not. The fact of some, like how would C interfere with A? So when C comes in,
right,
it's amplifying itself, and it's also inhibiting everything else, the neural representations of A and B.
Right.
So the types of associations that A can form are limited by the fact that something came after. But if A was the last item, there would not be any subsequent inhibition. So the trace of A gets to linger longer and form stronger associations with things that happened before A. That's basically the idea. So that the strength of the subsequent items is through that same competitive dynamic, weakening the representations of things in the past.
All right. So
another way of putting it is things in the beginning don't have much subtracting from them, interfering with them, because there's not much that preceded them to interfere. Right. Things in the middle have a lot of interfering. They have both the stuff that came before them and the interference of the stuff that came after. Okay. And the stuff at the end doesn't have interference that's coming after it. So it's relatively strong. So it's the beginning and end have the least amount of inhibition of interference. That's one way of thinking about it.
Okay, that makes a little more sense to me.
Yeah.
The stuff at the end would be interfered with by the stuff at the beginning. You'd have some pro-interference effects. Right. The recency effect isn't as strong as the primacy effect. Everything at the beginning is remembered much better than even the stuff at the end. And the stuff at the end will fade if you wait long enough to ask about it.
Mike, so actually this is not, maybe he's using terms in a slightly different way.
Yeah, that's the problem.
But it's not like too far from, say, how Carl Lashley had, like, talked about, competitive queuing and serial learning. So it's not very different from that. Maybe it's just that the terms with respect to how he says retroactive and proactive, because he's using the language of differential equations. That's where it's maybe the confusion. Yeah. But you can almost exactly map it onto the primacy, recency kind of language that is typically used in the psychology literature. So it's not different. He just wants to operationalize it better for the network that he says will solve the problem. So yeah.
So I guess the way to think about it is that competition is always happening in the present, but the learning of something that has happened is happening after it's gone. Like a fair chunk of, and we will actually get to this because which is why I didn't spend too much time on this stuff, because there's plenty of data on that Steve kind of brings up, such as backward masking and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of really weird, interesting, fascinating psychological phenomena, tons of different tasks, all of which you can think of using this active processing. So rather than like just to pick a comparison, the Radcliffe model of decision thresholds is that you have two completely independent basically hourglasses, right? They're just little ticking away, and for some reason people like these models, even though there's so much evidence against them. Like Paul Česek used to spend quite a bit of time arguing against those models. He's like, they're already falsified, but still people use them because they're really easy to understand. But what they lack is this active interference between one item and the other. And in the case of Paul Česek, he adds a third concept, which is urgency, which is that I'm not simply accumulating evidence for two different things independently. A, they're interfering with each other, and B, there's a third thing, which is forcing the system to make a decision based on an integrating urgency signal. So all these things can fit into the same idea, which is that there's positive feedback of representations and negative feedback of parallel representations. And to that, you can add things like arousal or overall kind of amplification, which when there's a symmetry that has already been broken, something like ACH or an arousal signal can make that symmetry breaking even more strong or fast. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like this way of looking at it. It gives more of an explanation than just saying current learning interferes with past learning.
Right.
Interferes with current learning. That doesn't really explain anything. It just describes the phenomenon.
Right.
More the explanation of why it's happening. And
so even though he uses the term non-local,
yeah,
the non-locality is subtle in this section, because from the perspective of standard physics, all the interactions are happening locally in time and locally from the perspective of the axon terminals. So the non-locality, if you're saying that this part of my visual field being bright is affecting how I perceive something over there, non-locality is in the perceptual space, because it's local with respect to any kind of physical phenomenon, and it's local in time.
That's super annoying, especially because the critique of things like backprop or backprop for time is that they're algorithms that depend on non-local information or non-locally like temporally available data, right? So yeah, it's annoying that would be the way he's talking about it.
Yeah, I don't like this term non-locality, but you have to, put scare quotes around it. So yeah, I was just leafing through to see if anything else that I marked out as interesting. But yeah, if anyone had any comments or anything, or anyone who's reading this, Karthik, anything you wanted to pull out that you thought might be interesting?
I think one of the lens I might add on this is that the right way to think about Steve's stuff and how it unfolds in time is that temporal patterns get converted to spatial patterns. Those spatial patterns you can look at either in that instant in time, or if you're the neuron receiving inputs from a set of other neurons, let's say, you're integrating their activations over time, right? And so in some cases, it's the learning that would occur based on their unfolding spatial pattern of activations. And in some cases, you talk about the steady state values of those spatial activations, but temporal stuff gets converted to spatial patterns.
Yes.
And the notion of parallel, I don't want to say like in terms of like computers, but there is also this notion of parallel processing or parallel representation that goes on, right, with these kinds of, because all of them are kind of held together, and then you're kind of like reading it out. So that the Gide example that Dan Bullock used to give, that's the example, right? I might be wrong. Good Day, the Australian version of Good Day.
What about it?
He always has that as the example in the way in which he talks about serial learning.
Right, yeah.
Like the parallel representation of GIDAY, all that. So actually, there's another, I mean, we can talk about it, but I think we'll anyway go through those ideas in the future when we talk about more of the visual stuff that comes from the next few chapters. He actually makes a very important point in the chapter. I think it's one of the last few pages where he talks about like you showed that whole idea of how do you get like once you add kernels, you get this whole inhibition versus excitation balance and all that. There was a figure, if you could go back to that.
Yeah. In NEOS?
Yeah, that's what the next one is good. Next one after this. Yeah, so this becomes very useful for us when we start using like distance-dependent networks. So one of the things that is very hard to see when you start doing like typical computer vision is that the computer vision people, when they like start talking about boundaries and edges and all that stuff, they don't really have any informational content related to what the edge means. It's sort of like just the change from one sort of a high contrast region to a low contrast region or whatever. The edge itself doesn't have any information. So for Steve, that's kind of like almost anathema. He'll be like, what do you mean that there is nothing? I can see stuff going from one to the other, right? So it's sort of like perceptually, it doesn't make sense for him to even like talk about edges in terms of zero crossings and whatnot, though he kind of operationalizes them partially using these differences of Gaussian. One of the things that this equation becomes very, very important in almost all his vision models. This is the equilibrium version of it. When you're applying this kind of a model for multiple scales, the noise suppression or the information noise suppression that Johan talked about earlier, when operated at multiple scales, actually is what enables you to like say what is the contour of an object versus what is not the contour of an object. So it's kind of this kind of like embedding and unlumping and sort of like going up in scale is by which he actually shows how you can find global contours of objects or whatever you see in a particular scene. And that's how you're able to do this sort of object or figure ground segregation or object ground segmentation, whichever you want to, whatever terms you want to use. So he kind of builds up on top of this kind of a system in different scales and how they operate and reduce noise. By noise, whatever is useless in that context. So that's kind of like the basis for how.
And for those who have done some image processing, just for whatever reason, convolving with a differential Gaussian filter will do things to images that are a bit like this. If you take two Gaussians, or you could do this, you could convolve with one Gaussian and then convolve with another Gaussian that's fatter, and then subtract the two images. And what you'll end up doing is picking out high contrast edge-like structures for that spatial scale defined by the difference between the two Gaussians, which is why when you're looking for objects that could be at multiple spatial scales or at multiple contrast differences, you have to do this many times and then kind of combine different edge detectors, basically. And deep learning systems are kind of effectively doing this with all those layers, finding things at different scales. But they're much less interpretable because
we don't even know whether they're doing it at multiple different scales. You can always find at the very top something is responding to something very, very local as well. So there is no guarantee that it's actually like increasingly getting to a point where it's like bigger and bigger stuff are getting represented higher, deeper layers. So there is no guarantee there. In Steve's approach, he will say that he's explicitly doing the way in which the spatial scaling works. It works with higher order grouping as well. So that's not a guarantee in any deep net-like system.
Well, don't convolutional neural networks do that by design? They have the
same. They are like, there is no, again, what are they really grouping? There is a difference between filtering it at a particular scale and then actually saying that I'm actually using certain features, right? So that's a different story between how you filter it at different scales, which is what the convolutional network is doing, each layer is doing, versus what is being pulled out as a feature in that layer. That's a very different story. There's no guarantee there. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it won't do it. I'm just saying that it's not, doesn't necessarily flow out of it.
Yeah, I mean, a convolutional net can create features like this, but it's like it learns them, and here it's just kind of there by design. And also to bring up the non-local thing, the convolutional net is non-local and it's not really realistic to biological processing.
And we'll be spending a lot of time on this. The next two chapters are about vision. So, which is why I didn't get into any details. The models will get increasingly complicated, so I won't necessarily be able to make quick little Python demonstrations. But I think that once the concepts are in place, the general idea will make sense.
I'll drop one. I know you sort of mentioned that the noise suppression basically enables bottom-up and top-down feedback and therefore resonance or whatever. But I would just add that, if you imagine what happens in a network with bottom-up and top-down feedback interactions, right? If you inject a little bit of noise into that system and you don't have proper noise suppression, you're basically just guaranteeing that your network's going to pick up the noise, start feeding back, and all of a sudden everyone's activation levels are, everyone or whoever had the noise or input or whatever, those things are going to shoot up and saturate, right? So, it's that noise the ability to suppress noise without wiping everything out becomes critical for being able to do bottom-up and top-down balancing, right? You want to be able to pick up features that are relevant, suppress features that aren't, and if you can't do that, then there's no way to have feedback in a way that doesn't just cause that explosion.
Yep. So we'll see many iterations of this. Since vision is coming up soon, Karthik will be able to guide us. I'm going to stop the share now, and so next time we'll talk about chapter 3. Recording.